Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue with our series on basic sociology. Dear friends, in our previous session we discussed on feminist theory. Today also we are going to discuss on the theory in detail. We are going to discuss about the history, theories and consequences. Friends, for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is a renowned professor of sociology and currently she is professor in Center for Study of Social System, School of Social Sciences, JNU. So let's welcome our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, and let's try to discover, to learn more about feminist theory. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Good afternoon, and today we are going to speak, as has already been stated, on feminist theories, histories, theories and consequences. I'd like to speak a little bit on the specificity of the manner in which I have framed the question. Normally, when we discuss theories, we tend to look at the features of the theories, the kind of themes or issues or categories which define those theories. I want to push that a little bit and talk about the histories within which feminist theories have emerged, what are its features, and what are its consequences. So there is a dynamic aspect to theories. Theories are not only to be studied or to be understood for pedagogic, teaching or learning experiences, but theories are a product of society. They are a product of society and therefore an enabling way, a self-conscious, constructed, focused way of understanding the manner in which society is constructed. Therefore, we have to look at the context within which theories emerge. Why do they emerge in specific contexts? Why do they raise certain kind of issues and not raise certain kind of issues? In the last lecture, we discussed the invisibility of gender in many mainstream theories. And not only do theories emerge in specific contexts, but theories importantly have consequences. That is, they have an impact on society. So it is this relationship that I wish to explore in this section. Now, there are various kinds of feminist theories and we will be doing it systematically. But even when we do it systematically in terms of the different kinds of feminist theories, whether it's the liberal theory or the radical theories or the socialist feminist theories, or more contemporarily the whole question of the black feminist theories, feminism of color, or most recently the whole issue of queer theory, there are certain things which are common to different kinds of feminist theories. What is it? Recall our earlier discussion on common sense theory and feminist theory. A feminist perspective means to understand and deconstruct the normal, appearing social order to unravel the hidden transcripts of patriarchy and female/women's subordination and subjugation. This seems a very complicated kind of formulation, so let's break it up. In fact, learning of theory should enable you to break up the exact meaning of what these definitions suggest. It means to deconstruct the normal. What do you mean by deconstructing the normal? Deconstructing the normal means questioning the common sense, questioning the taken for granted. We think it is normal for many middle class families of an earlier period that the father goes out to work, the mother stays at home and cooks. It is normal to think that the father would be more educated, the mother would be less educated. It would be normal to think that the woman should not speak loudly or should not question the orders of the rest of the family members, especially male members. All that, deconstructing the normal, means questioning this as something which is normal. So in feminist theorization, and I would argue theorization in general, we have to use the word normal in quotes. That is, we must not take any normal as taken for granted. So deconstruct the normal, appearing social order to unravel the hidden transcripts. So the normal social order must be questioned and we must try and find out what is the hidden transcripts of patriarchy, that what is the underlying causes or underlying principles which constitute or make or construct patriarchy, which we cannot see but which function. For example, we had discussed earlier how patrilineality, that is line of descent from father to son, can define the entire structure, not just of inheritance, but also of power equations, decision making, and differential access to resources in society. So, a feminist perspective, whatever kind, and we'll be discussing the different kinds in detail shortly, has to have this common principle that we do not take anything for granted. We then move on to questions of contexts and feminist theories. Now, the first point that I want to say, that history of feminism is inextricably, that is closely linked to historiography as the questions of politics and power. That are the key questions in history, our key questions are power and politics. And feminist theory or feminist history cannot be discussed without understanding questions of politics and power. The interesting and the challenging thing is, however, that power and politics is not visible the same way as normally power and politics is visible to us. So, normally by politics we mean political parties, we mean politicians, we mean people doing something for necessarily political or vested interests, and power means people who hold certain visible strengths of power. For example, ministers would have certain kinds of power, bureaucrats would have certain kinds of power. That is not just the kind of politics and power that we are talking about when we talk about feminist politics and feminist power. We are talking about power that appears to be normal, but actually is showing hidden dynamics of power. We do not understand that when we say a little girl is born, the example I gave you last time, and you say that this little baby girl is just a guest for a few days, or is somebody's wealth, paraya dhan, or she will leave very quickly. Those don't seem to be about power and politics, they seem to be a culture, a neutral term. The whole argument of feminist theorization is to show that culture too has power questions. So, that could be even expressed in seemingly neutral proverbs, seemingly even gestures of affection, seemingly even in small customs or practices, rituals, festivals, when we talk about, for example, Kanya Dan. And you may feel it's just giving away, and in English you have the word giving away the daughter. Now, you don't see any politics in it, but if you change your lens and try to explore the patriarchal transcript as the word was discussed, then we will see that when you say it's given away or you're giving dan, it means she is a property which belongs to somebody else, that she is not in control of herself. So, this power and politics is therefore very central in feminist theories. The second thing that we have to realize that is common to all feminist theory is an acknowledgement that men and women are unequally placed in society. We do not occupy the same spaces. How that difference and inequality is understood and addressed have played out differently in different points of time in histories and geographies. Now, what do I mean by histories and geographies? We mean that while it is common that all feminists agree that women are unequally and differentially placed vis-a-vis men, what we have not looked at is the fact that politics of power is played out very differently in different periods of time, that is different histories, and in different geographies, meaning in different territories. That is, the way it played out in maybe 17th century Europe was different from the way it played out in 19th century India. The way it played out maybe in the United States of America in the 20th century is different from the way it played out in India in 19th and 20th century. So, that these geographies have to be looked at very carefully and also have to be looked at differently, that is, the histories also have to be looked at differently. This, however, raises a certain question that are these historical periods disconnected? Do they have no connection? And are these geographies disconnected? That is there no connection between colonial Britain and India, or maybe colonial America and India, or colonial America and colonial Britain, or questions of contemporary India and America? The argument that I am trying to put forward is that there are deep connections and it is necessary to look at these connections. Here, I would like to take you back to an early lecture that I gave on the emergence and growth of Indian sociology. And there I mentioned that there are certain features that we need to look at: modernity, modernities, the growth of capitalism, capitalism, colonialism, India and capitalism, India and modernities. Central here you can see my emphasis on modernities, emphasis on capitalism, emphasis on colonialism. What I am trying to argue here is that when the West modernized, it modernized in a context of growing capitalism, and that in turn impacted us, because British capitalism would not have been so successful had Britain not colonized us. That is, there is a simultaneity in the rise of British capitalism and in the rise of British colonialism and our own experience of colonialism. In other words, that is, our history of modernity is mediated by our history of colonialism. That made things very complicated. That complicated and ambiguity of colonialism often therefore led to questions like, isn't feminism something Western? Is it something that we should adopt? And in order to address these questions, I want to go back and understand the histories, the complex histories within which histories not just of feminism arose, but histories of liberalism, histories of socialism, histories of democracy, and interestingly, histories of nationalism itself. What were those new ideas, new questions, new imaginings that modernity brought about? You have already studied the ideas of enlightenment and the key question, the right to question, and the point of freedoms, that we are all born free, we all have equal rights. We as people of any community or group have a right for self-determination and right to sovereignty, and Swaraj, as our freedom fighter spoke, is our birthright. These new ideas and new questions were not just confined to the manner in which studied various different kinds of problems. It was very, very central to the manner in which ideas of feminism emerged in India. I want to speak a little bit here on the kind of connections. I'll come back little later on the details about liberal feminism, socialist feminism, or materialist feminism, or radical feminism. Here, I want to discuss that how did liberalism impact us in India, so far away from France, where the French Revolution took place and many of the theorists of liberalism emerged, or theories of liberalism in the West. Did it impact us? Did socialist ideas or Marxist ideas impact us? Did it have an impact on Indian national movement, on even in defining the identity of India? Did ideas of feminism impact India? Is it something new just yesterday, or is it something that we can find even in the early writings of the 19th century, not just by men but also by women? Do we not need to go back into that history? I begin with something which you may feel is completely unrelated, but I will try to show you where the linkage is, because this is a concrete historical document, the Karachi Resolution of 1931. As you are familiar, when the Indian National Congress was fighting for the independence of the country, they would have different kinds of congresses, that is, meetings in different parts of the country, and one of them was then in Karachi, then part of undivided India, in 1931. And this resolution is very central, because this resolution in a certain sense informed the vision of independent India, informed the vision of the Indian state in the early decades and was very central to the ideas that informed the Indian nationalist movement. Let us examine some of these ideas that were expressed in the Karachi Resolution. Freedom of expression, association, meeting, freedom of religion, protection of all cultures and languages, citizens should be all equal before the law, no disability in employment or trade or profession on account of religion, caste or sex, special protection of women workers, free compulsory education, relief of agricultural indebtedness, control of usury, children not to be employed in mines, proper standard of life for industrial workers and suitable machinery, for settlement of dispute between employers and workers and protection against old age, sickness, etc. Why do I emphasize these issues? I emphasize these issues because they all reflect modernity. They all reflect ideas of modernity and ideas of liberalism and democracy. When we say freedom of expression, the right to speak is not something which is always given to us at all points of time. This is a right which we claim for our own in modern times, informed by the idea of freedom and democracy, freedom of association and meeting, that we have a right to make a group of our own, maybe a resident welfare association, maybe a trade union, maybe a teachers association, maybe a students union, maybe a commercial group of capitalists, like for example FICCI. But the right to make your own association rests upon a certain principle of modernity, which is the right of individual rights. That is, we have decided to become a member of the association, not by birth. We are members of a community by birth, but we become a member of an association by choice because we are committed to certain ideas. Freedom of religion, extremely modern, because the idea that all religions have an equal right. Very different in a theocratic kind of frame of reference, where the argument would be that my religion is the true religion and all people, if they have to be saved, should conform to that religion. But in modern societies, we learned that we have to respect other forms of life, other cultures, other religions. Therefore, protection of all cultures and languages. This is something that was very central to Indian history right from the beginning. Karachi Resolution is 1931. It was a culmination of past history. Compare that to the West, where multiculturalism was a very late advent. A recognition of other cultures came as a late advent. Our histories are more complex, that we understood the importance of diversity and recognition of different identities. What we failed, however, is enabling those ideas to be completely accepted by all sections of people who continue to believe that power is the best way of exercising rights, whereas here the understanding was the recognition of others' rights. Now look at protection of culture, language, freedom of religion, expression, association and meetings. These have all been derived from liberalism, democratic theory, which made an impact on the Indian national movement. Come to the other example, no disability in employment on grounds of religion, caste or sex. You here see not only equal rights to other communities, other religions, all castes, but also gender, sex, special protection of women workers. So you have clear influence of feminist ideas of equality being evident here in the Karachi statement. Not only feminist ideas of equality, liberal feminist ideas of equality, but also socialist ideas of recognition of the rights of women workers. Therefore, special protection of women workers. You see an example of relief of agricultural indebtedness. You will recall at that period of time, and even today in some sections, the peasants were deeply indebted. Today we have a crisis of farmers' suicides and farmers' indebtedness. There was a recognition there that this agricultural indebtedness must be resolved, a recognition for the rights of farmers, peasants, poorer section. Where do these ideas come from? The ideas come from socialist ideas, socialist feminism, and socialism in general. Children not to be employed in mines and factory, recognition of child rights, which is a much more recent right in global international discourse. Industrial workers, old age, sickness. So see how modern these Karachi resolutions were. Now, why did I look at this Karachi resolution? I wanted to see that what political and social theories are evident in the resolutions, and I want you to explore and apply your own understanding of liberalism to see that are these liberal theory, is there an impact, are there an impact of socialist theory, are there an impact of feminist theory, are there an impact of modern theories. This is extremely important for you. It's not important just to understand what liberal feminism is or materialist feminism is or radical feminism is, but to recognize that these theories have consequences. That is, they have made us what we are. Had not I been given constitutional rights not to be discriminated against, to avail of equal education, equal employment, an opportunity to come out in public and perhaps give a lecture like this, I would not be in the position I am today. So we are indebted to histories and we are indebted to theories. So you have to understand theories, in particular political theories like feminist theories, have implications on us. So do liberal theories, so do socialist theories, radical theories, etc. Now I go on in little greater detail into different kinds of feminism, different types of feminism, and when you look at various kinds of books and textbooks and guidebooks, etc., you will find that there is no uniformity in these categories. Like I have chosen to write liberal feminism, materialist feminism, radical feminism. In many places I have seen liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, socialist feminism, then radical feminism, and then perhaps feminism of color or feminism of other countries. I make this point to alert you to the fact there is nothing sacred or sacrosanct whether you have 4 points or whether you have 5 points. These are categories by which we understand. Liberal feminism, for example, I have already alluded to democratic theory, ideas of all people being born equal, equal access to various kinds of resources and rights. Materialist feminism is something I am using in order to incorporate ideas from both Marxist feminism and socialist histories. I am not so comfortable with the distinction between Marxist feminism and socialist feminism because that distinction itself emerged in the specific context of the history of West Europe, where you had a break from what would be understood as orthodox Marxism and a certain kind of democratic socialist feminism which emerged over there. What I would find more productive is materialist feminism. So first liberal feminism, second materialist feminism, and third radical feminism, which is a contested term again because in the Western world it's understood in a specific context, but it can be understood in very different contexts, like for asking why not call Marxist feminism radical feminism or not. So what I'm trying to tell you is that be aware about the nuances and the specificities of each of these terms. Now we will sort of shortly come to what is liberal feminism. Liberal feminism, there are various shades of liberal feminisms, but there is one which is simply called liberal feminism, and it conceives of freedom as personal autonomy, living a life of one's own choosing, and political autonomy, being co-author of the conditions under which one lives. The other is commonly called classical liberal feminism or sometimes libertarian feminism, and here these terms are used interchangeably here. Now what do we mean by liberal feminism conceives of freedom as personal autonomy? Well, what it means is young people are very familiar with the term choice, and very often you say it is my choice, I wish to do it, it's my space. This is talking about life of one's own choosing. And political autonomy, that this decision to be free or to make your own choice would not be possible had you not got political autonomy. That is, if we did not live in a democratic society where our rights are enshrined by the law of the land, then we would not be in a position to exercise our choice. Like, I like to teach, I choose to teach. I think my mother would have loved to teach too, but she did not have the conditions which allowed her to go out and take employment and teach, an opportunity which I have got thanks to the histories of movements before me, histories of feminism, and the fact that today we are empowered by these theories. So, the question of personal autonomy and political autonomy are closely interlinked. In a world like today, where you have a resurgence of individualism, very often you may feel that you are free because you wish to be free or because you are empowered volitionally to be free. Very important to go back and understand that this freedom to be able to be free is something which has emerged from hard struggles fought by our foremothers and forefathers and enshrined in a constitution which therefore has to be protected at all costs. In those countries which do not have a democratic constitution, if your rights are taken away, you have nowhere to go because those rights are not recognized at all. If those rights are not recognized, where is the role of courts? Where is the role of press? Now, if you notice, therefore, the implicate implications of what feminists call that the personal is political and the political bears upon the personal. We've now just talked about liberal feminism, and the other is commonly called classical liberal feminism or libertarian feminism, by which we basically means that there should not be any hindrance in our exercising our freedom or our rights. This is particularly interesting in contemporary times when we have what is called the emergence of neoliberalism, which talks about unfettered freedom and the salience of the market principle, that the market is the final decisive influence, where the argument would be there should be no interference in the working of the market. Now, we are not too sure whether this libertarian feminism should be considered a version of liberal feminism at all, but this is something which I will leave you to discuss, and I'll come back very shortly with materialist feminism.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on feminist theory. Dear friends, there is a lot more for you. You are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on feminist theory, and we tried to cover the maximum part in our previous session. Now we are going to start with materialistic theory and materialistic feminism, and afterwards we are going to talk on feminism in India. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is a renowned professor of sociology, and through her we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics and issues of sociology. So let's welcome our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, and let's carry forward the lecture. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the session.
So we discussed liberal feminism the session just before this, and we now move on to what we call materialist feminism. And it's the materialist feminism, most importantly, is not something what we call economic determinist feminism. And I want to point this out because very often whenever you talk about Marxist feminism, the assumption is that Marx was an economic determinist. But in actual times, if any of you have the opportunity to read Marx's work, his original strength was that he did not conceive of the economic as an abstract system with its own internal laws. Indeed, the preferred choice of the term political economy suggests that it was understood as a realm of social relations constructed through social activity. So if you read his work, you will see that he uses the term social relations of production, forces of production, not economy is something which is disconnected with questions of social organization or relationship between groups of people differentially located vis-a-vis production processes. Materialist feminism, understood in this fashion, therefore foregrounds the social. Social understood in its widest sense, not social as something separate from economy, separate from culture, separate from politics. Social as encompassing social structures, relations, practices, private, personal, state, market, and not reduce all social structures, relations and practices only to the economy. Even the understanding of capitalism as a certain social formation would suggest a recognition that this is not economic reductionism, but it constitutes important questions of relations between different groups of people. The most important text from the materialist feminist text is something which unfortunately is very neglected today, but whose ideas have been appropriated by other theorists, and in that process the original text has often been forgotten. And that text is The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. Marx's close friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels has written about it. Here you notice that what is being addressed is the relationship between the family, the state and private property, things which you normally do not look at in any close connection. What is the basic argument that materialist feminists argue? Materialist feminists firstly argue, drawing from an understanding of historical materialism, that historically in different societies at different historical periods of time, we have different kinds of production relations and social formations. Therefore, to give an example, in pre-industrial societies, say take the example of pre-industrial England, since England was the first industrial country, you would have a social formation which was pre-industrial. Technology would be not so developed. You would have various kinds of occupational groups pursuing their own kind of crafts, technology. For example, you would have weavers, you would have potters, you would have masons, you would have different kinds of group, agriculturalists, you would have ironsmiths, you would have different kind of groups with their limited technology. And very often in pre-industrial India, pre-industrial England, as has been described so eloquently by Anne Oakley in the standard book Housewife, which you must have a look at, that production took place in the home. Nobody went out to industries and factories. So if you're a weaver, you weaved at home. If you were a potter, you worked at home. If you were in agriculture, you went to the fields or did extended agricultural activities in the household. Now, Anne Oakley tried to show that with technological developments and the Industrial Revolution, you started having a production which was much larger in scale. You had huge tools, you had the steam engine, you had various kinds of machinery, equipment which could no longer occupy the space of a small household. So, there was a division that took place between the home and the outside. All these years the home was equally productive. Home was not a place where you just watched television or ate dinner together after everybody came back home, where it was a place of leisure, but where nothing was produced. But the home itself was a productive unit. But with the growth of industrial capitalism, that divide took place between the home and the outside, and between men and women, particularly bourgeois men or propertied men or middle class men who went out to work, leaving behind women to look after domesticity. Here is not the time to discuss the ideology of domesticity, the idea that women must keep their homes in a particular order. Maybe we can come back to it later, and men must go back. But at the same point of time when this was taking place, women were entering industries and factories in England, including mines. Why England? Right here in our country, the textile mills in Bombay, which was one of the first industries, women workers were there in very large numbers. Women workers were there in the mines in Jharia, in Jharkhand, what is contemporary Jharkhand. Women were plantation workers taken as indentured labor to Assam from what is the Chhattisgarh or the Jharkhand area. So, you have to look at this whole question about how the division that took place between production and no production changed. Likewise, the nature of family changed. What would be a loose agglomeration of family members changed in the modern era when you have an idea of the normal family being father, mother, 2 children. This was not always the case. You would have extended families among landed communities in our country, agricultural landlords and landed people, but very often you would have smaller families with people who are agricultural workers, Dalit families, nomadic families, where you would not have the same kind. So, what Engels was trying to show was that the family was also historically specific, depending upon its relationship to the production relations. He also brought in the whole question of private property, that at a particular point of time historically, when you did not have surplus production, where you had subsistence cultivation, where you maybe had nomadic forms, where you did not have accumulation of wealth which could then be appropriated by some people, that is, you grow more than you consume. When you grow more than you consume, somebody is going to take charge of what is the extra and become owners of that extra, which becomes then private property. And then he links that in turn with what is understood as the state. In liberal theory, the state is understood as a neutral mechanism to dispute between warring contending parties. In materialist theory, the state is understood as a power mechanism which emerges from society itself. So, the dominant sections of society are also the people who occupy power at the state. And what Engels tried to show, and Marx later, is that this has to be historically understood, that the division between men and women were also historically constituted in, ironically very often, in what are considered developed society, the division between men and women are more marked. So, the idea of women being helpless, feminine, useless, unproductive, irrational emerged in societies and sections which would be considered more developed. So, among the landed or the bourgeois sections of Western Europe, it was the women were supposed to be a good woman or a proper woman only if she was helpless or feminine, to an extent where she could be of no use and was dependent. But that idea of femininity emerged in those sections which were in a more privileged section. Ironically, women of the peasants or working class, Dalit women, black women, very often had to live very hard conditions, and it was not considered to be a privilege to be helpless, to be powerless. So here again he tried to show that class stratification, class being defined as those people who have access and control of private wealth and those who do not, have very different kinds of family and very different kinds of femininity and masculinity. And if this was the dominant idea that women are helpless, that the dominant people are the people who rule the state, it was but natural that the state in turn would think women are helpless. So often I find in old policy documents people will write that, look, women in India never worked, they have just started working. Very often in writings, essays, answer sheets, I find this phrase that Indian women have just started working. When we say Indian women just started working, we are doing what we discussed in the earlier lecture, that is, we are rendering them invisible, that we physically see them work, but we can consider them as incognito, that they become cognitively invisible. Remember the discussion on the Indian census and our inability to remember or categorize and count women workers, because we probably never thought of women workers as workers, or we never thought of those women who work as women, bringing in our own class, caste biases even when we look at and understand reality. Materialist feminism, therefore, has great relevance even if we have to understand contemporary times, to understand that capitalism has a relentless urge to maximize profit, and they will reorganize social conditions of work as well as private spaces depending upon the imperative need to profit. I had given you the example before. Take the example of the growth of outsourcing in India. When globalization was at its peak and the Americans wanted to do business by getting hired labor in places where labor was not so expensive, you had the booming of the outsourcing sector, in which many women worked. Many women worked, just like in many of the export sectors like garment or leather, or maybe even in some of the transnational corporations which have their factories over here, maybe Nike, maybe Reebok, which are producing here, would get labor which is much cheaper. What do you see in this? A complex agglomeration or a complex connection between macro capitalism, the logic to maximize profit, and the imperative need to reorganize forms of production, labor reorganization, depending upon what will maximize profit. When they found, for instance, that in India, maybe to pay people to work in some of these service sector was more expensive in Delhi and Bombay or Chennai, they decided that maybe it would be more productive to have these kind of service outsourcing sectors in smaller towns. So you have a certain imperatives of broader economic materialist developments which impinge upon the lives of young women, young men, and thereby also maybe in their families, that maybe if you have two IT professionals or two people working at all night in the outsourcing sectors, maybe their domestic life will be reordered in a particular fashion. Maybe they'll be more informed by the ideas of feminist theories and therefore would live lives which are very different. Maybe they would have different ideas of freedom. So going back to the point, theories not only emerge in certain contexts, but theories matter, theories have certain consequences. I now come to radical feminism, and usually in textbooks they have it like this: liberal feminism, which we've discussed. We've discussed materialist feminism, which is a combination of Marxist and socialist feminism, and we come to radical feminism. Now you must remember that these categories, I did not make them up, nor did you make them up. They emerged by scholars in the West. And why West? Because they were more dominant not only in politics or economics but also in the academia. And it is in the West that radical feminism emerged in a particular fashion. In the 1970s, radical feminism discourse in the West attempted to develop a universally valid and trans-historical account of women's oppression. The idea was that irrespective of which kind of women you were, black or white, poor or rich, you had a shared oppression as being women, and therefore who was responsible for this collective victimhood of all women would be a certain understanding of patriarchy or male dominance or male control of public and private structures. Now, this understanding of patriarchy can be looked at very differently. For example, patriarchy within materialist feminism would be the manner in which Engels was arguing a certain understanding of the relationship between the family organization, gender division of labor, as well as production outside, where the emphasis would be on the relationship between patriarchy and capitalism in the contemporary period. The radical feminist argument would be that it didn't matter whether you were socialist or liberal, that feminism had to take up the collective issue of women's oppression, discrimination and inequality, which emerged from a certain understanding of brute male power on women. And therefore, the idea of sisterhood as a collective whole question of an anti-male dominated institutions. At the level of the ground level, very often there was an expression of anti-male hostility, an argument that the notion of sisterhood is central and we have to attack the whole issue of male dominance. This is a version of feminism which has a wide circulation because it probably evoked the strongest anti-feminist sentiments, and there was a certain ridiculing of it, sort of a caricaturing, oh, these women are people who are just anti-men. Therefore, we have to look at this question very, very carefully because of its implications. It had a reason why it emerged in the West, because many educated women at that point of time, particularly say in North America or West Europe, realized that despite education, despite living in a liberal democratic world, despite living in social democratic world, very often they had to face brute men's power at home. The work of looking after babies, cooking, cleaning homes was left to women. So you had at that point of time various kind of radical feminist texts. You can find out for yourself what they are, but for now I'm just mentioning Shulamit Firestone, Dialectic of Sex, Kate Millett, Theory of Sexual Politics, where the whole thing comes basically about drawing sometimes also from psychological questions of malehood, which is biologically driven in certain senses of the term, psychological questions of loss, psychoanalytical categories, but here is not the time to look into this question. What we will now look into is that do all these have a relationship to what was happening to us over here? Well, a lot of things was happening to us over here, but many of it was not being recorded or being visible, or not even be visible in the textbooks which talk about feminism, socialist, liberal, radical, and mention women of color as a deference to the rise of the black movement, which opposed the idea of a woman which was universal and did not look at the differences between the rich and the poor, between the black woman and the white woman, between the so-called upper caste women and the Dalit women, between the bourgeois and the working class women, between the tribal woman and the woman who may be married to the timber contractor in the same region. So we did have a long history of our struggles, and that is the reason I brought in the Karachi document earlier, to show to you that while all this was happening in the West, many things were happening here too. But we have our own histories, and we have to go back to our histories and geographies and a complex tryst with modernities and tradition. And we must understand our past not as something static, that there was this wonderful golden age where everything was wonderful and then there was a fall and now we go back to the golden past. That is not social science. That is fantasy, and sometimes those fantasies can have deep political implications. What is our past? Our pasts are rich. It is a diverse country. We have multiple histories, multiple pasts, multiple folk stories, multiple religions, languages. It has a past of great achievements, great philosophies, critique, religious movements which opposed questions of bigotry, religious movements which talked about unity between religions. We have talks about the Sufi movement, the Bhakti movement. We have a very, very rich histories, and those histories did talk about inequalities of caste, gender and class, but it did not articulate it in the modern idiom of liberal feminism or socialist feminism or radical feminism. It expressed feminist ideas, but did not have the political structure to articulate it in the language of rights, which is only possible in a modern democratic country. We need to go back to the past in order to retrieve both its strength and recognize its weakness and the reasons why we should claim parts of it and reject parts of it. I am quickly giving you 3 texts of the histories of Indian women's movements. There are 2 of them, which is my own work, the Indian Women's Movement, Reform and Revival, and the other, Feminism in India. And a third book, which is a wonderful collection of essays, Kumkum Sangari and Suresh Ved, Recasting Women, Essays in Colonial History. We will not have the time to delve into them, but perhaps in my next lecture I will look into it. Now, what was this rediscovery of feminist past that we are talking about, and why in the 19th century became so important in India to start thinking about feminist politics? It was because, as I mentioned, that British colonialism had its impact here because we were part of colonial Britain. The British came here with very strong ideas of a civilized West, a civilized Great Britain, and an uncivilized barbaric non-West, that is the colonized Indian natives. And one of the stark things which gave them more weight to their argument was the fact that so many communities in our country treated women so shabbily in the 19th century. All of you are familiar with the prohibition of widow remarriage, sati, child marriage of women, inability for women, a prohibition of women to be educated. So, the 19th century reformers exposed to Western education ideas of enlightenment, ideas of liberal feminism, ideas of socialist feminism, rethought and critiqued the society they lived. They also returned to traditions and discussed the religious texts and scriptures, arguing that what ought to be retrieved and what ought to be critiqued. So, the tradition of critique was something which we must always develop and consider to be something very important in our modern and traditional history. Because all ideas were being re-examinings, there were questionings. And what do questionings mean? Not taking anything at all for granted. I have a certain tasks for you which may be interesting for you to try and discover texts from your region which reveal our complex pasts. We had seen how gendered our proverbs are in the last lecture. Maybe you can find out what the proverbs are there in your part, and whether you can have proverbs which challenge gender stereotype. Not surprisingly, we also have challenges to such gender inequalities. Let us name some texts that may be of interest to you. I am now talking about certain feminist texts which you must look at. The most marvelous 2 volumes of Suzy Tharu and K. Lalita, which is a compilation of women's writing in India from 6th century BC to early 20th century. Remember, these are times when people were aware of their feminist consciousness, but they did not articulate in the language which we articulate it today, in the categories which we articulate today. The other is Tarabai Shinde's Sri Purush Tulana, a comparison of men and women, and Rokia Sakhawat Hussein's Sultana's Dream. Tarabai Shinde's work is in the 19th century. Rokea's book is 1905. It goes back a long ago, challenging the idea that feminism is something which has happened yesterday or something which only young, fashionable women practice. These have deep roots in our culture. I cannot go into it in details over here, but I would like you to think about the whole question about these texts and what did these texts there. I'm not going to go into the second phase of the women's movement. That I'm going to do in my next lecture, but what I'm going to do over here is go back to the feminist texts and try to understand what these texts were talking about. Susie Tharu and Lalita's books, these people went to different parts, remote villages, small towns, dug up private collections, trunks, found out how women used to very often write secretly, how they learned to write secretly and express their desires. It has stories and poems from 6th century, the Buddhist writings, Buddhist monks, women monks. It tells us about, the Marathi texts of the Bhakti movement, the kind of questions that they raise. Radical, by the term radical feminist, not in the way we understood radical feminism in the 1970s in the West, but radical in the questions they asked. Tarabai Shinde, which she talks about a comparison of men and women, where she is examining the double morality. She begins with the story of a little baby found in the dustbin, and the rumor and the gossip which takes place that whose baby could it be, and has there been an illegitimate birth, and who could the mother be, and a great deal of discussion, and finally even a court case against this widowed woman. And her entire text talks about this double morality, raising this fundamental question that was there not a father to that illegitimate child, and if there was that father probably belonged to the extended family within which the widow lived, but within which she was in a powerless situation, a question of politics. That is, what constitutes the question of legitimacy, what constitutes the question of illegitimacy. You will find Sultana's Dream a wonderful text, and particularly relevant today when we have questions of sexual harassment and safety of women's movement and safety of roads. This is a story about a land where women are in parda, a dream world where women are in parda, and when asked that why are women in parda, the answer that Rokeya gives is that the streets are too dangerous when men are there. Now this, by contemporary standard, is a radical statement. It was written in 1905. I don't have too much time to develop on this, but later in the next lecture we'll discuss more contemporary feminist theory, its location, the context, its histories, its geographies and its consequences. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session on feminist theory. Dear friends, we believe that you might have lots of questions to be answered. Do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Here you can post your questions as well as your feedback too. Friends, we'll try to give answers to your questions when next time Professor Maitri Chaudhary visits our studio. You can see this lecture the number of times you wanted, as we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you so that you can access it as many as times you want. So friends, today we are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again and would be conducting more sessions on feminist theory. Keep watching us, keep writing us. Yes, we will be meeting soon. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.